Good evening, everybody. On behalf of Georgetown University, Qatar, and our Center for International and Regional Studies, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's event, Who Belongs to a Country? National Representation and Identity at the FIFA World Cup 2022. My name is Professor Daniel Reiche, and I'm leading the CIRS research initiative, Building a Legacy FIFA World Cup 2022. This is the sixth event in our World Cup 2022 lecture series, and this is the first time we are hosting a panel rather than an individual speaker. Issues around citizenship, identity, and national belonging are a much discussed topic around any mega sporting event. May it be the African Cup of Nations, which is currently taking place in Cameroon, the Winter Olympic Games, which will start in 2 days in Beijing, or the FIFA World Cup, which will be hosted by Qatar at the end of this year. The Nigerian's national men's team made headlines at this year's African Cup of Nations because it featured a record number of 6 dual national players who were born and raised abroad. Media articles stated that the national team's identity is being eroded with the introduction of so many players from abroad. At the upcoming Winter Olympics, 91 countries will be participating, 18 of them being tropical countries represented by dual nationals who were born and raised in winter sport countries. For instance, Bolivia will be represented by athletes born and raised in Germany and Finland. Eritrea will be represented by an alpine skier who grew up in Canada, and Nigeria by a French-born cross-country skier. In the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing, there are also numerous cases of athletes who have switched nationalities. Mexico, for example, will be represented by a former member of the US ski team who married a Mexican citizen and has been competing for Mexico since obtaining dual citizenship. Even China, which has been reluctant in the past to naturalize foreign-born athletes, has included 2 Californian natives in its Olympic team. Also, at this year's FIFA World Cup, there will be discussions about issues such as developed countries relying on immigrant players, developing countries being mainly comprised of diaspora athletes, and also most certainly the composition of the host country's national team. And these are issues that we will be discussing tonight. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our guests. To keep this introduction short, I will briefly introduce our speakers before they make their approximately 5-minute long contributions. And after 25 minutes of introductory remarks, we will open the floor for Q&A. To ask a question, refer to the Q&A feature, please. Feel free to type in your question anytime throughout the event. If you wish to tweet about this event, please use our hashtag CIRS2022 and refer to our website for the past 5 lectures, our blog with 26 short articles so far, and also our podcast series for 17 conversations with experts on the 2022 World Cup. You can subscribe to our podcast Qatar FIFA World Cup 2022 on all common podcast platforms. Moving to our panel. 7 different nationalities are represented by our 5 speakers today. Our first panelist is from the Netherlands, Gijs van Kampenhout. He is an assistant professor for geography, youth and education at Utrecht University. He is also a member of the Sport and Nation Network. In his PhD project, Gijs mapped why and how often nationality transfers of football players occurred in the FIFA World Cups from 1930 until 2014. Gijs, thank you for being with us tonight. And my first question to you is, how has the participation of foreign-born players in the World Cup developed over time? And it would be great if you could also share your insights about the Dutch national team and its reliance on immigrants.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Daniel, to start with. I'm going to share my screen because, well, what I've been doing for my PhD is counting how many foreign-born players have been participating throughout the history of the Football World Cup. So to give you an idea about this volume, well, I've mapped it out in this graph. But what do we see? Well, first of all, you can see there's a lot of ebb and flow movements over time. You see highs and lows throughout the different editions of the World Cup. on the one hand, and on the second hand, you see that, well, basically foreign-born players have been always present in the context of the FIFA World Cup. So this means that this is nothing new. We've been discussing it, but it's basically happens all the time. Well, and it's basically because the national team seems to be a reflection of societies that they represent. And also these numbers are a reflection in that sense of the inflow of the migrants in a certain society. Furthermore, it seems that the presence of foreign-born players in certain national teams, as well as in that sense in the World Cup, is fundamentally bound up with general migration patterns. That's one thing we can make out of this graph. Secondly, and notwithstanding several empirical limitations, for example, in how to count these foreign-born players, is that when you critically compare these numbers, so the share of foreign-born players in the Football World Cup, with trends and patterns in international migration, as I just mentioned, you see that there's a big gap between these numbers. On average, there's like 6 to 12% of foreign-born players at the World Cup, as you can see in this graph, while in international migration, these trends are only between the 2 to 4%. Well, this deviation, well, that seems a bit logical, as football players are often highly skilled, therefore globally employable, which makes them highly mobile. But still, there's quite a big gap between the two numbers. What can be said is that international football, and perhaps the FIFA World Cup as its apex, well, it's been a space of migration par excellence. What's further interesting, the last remark about this graph, is the later additions, which I, let me see, encircle here, that since the mid-1990s, we see that there's an increase, a steadily increase in the numbers of foreign-born players at the World Cup, which is seemingly diverging further away from the numbers of international migrants in general. Well, part of this is, of course, as a consequence of the globalization of immigrations. More and more people are on the move, but also the increased importance of sports for countries. You want to have the best in the field to represent you. What all these observations basically implies is that throughout its history, the Football World Cup has become more migratory, at least from an immigration perspective. And it also shows, not these numbers, but behind these numbers is that there's a diversification going on within the number of foreign-born players, and the diversification in terms of nationality. I will illustrate this by giving the example of the Dutch national team. Here you see a photo of the Dutch national team from 2014, and faded are the players who are foreign-born. In that sense, we, the Dutch, will lose quite a lot of players if you take out foreign-born players. I've also set this out in a graph over time, also including the European Championship, and you see that the foreign-born players, well, from the 1980s onwards, have made their entrance, so to say, into the Dutch national football team. These are absolute numbers, it's not relative numbers, but you can see that mainly there's an influence of Surinamese players, which is, of course, it's really logic in my opinion, as Suriname has been a colony until 1975 of the Netherlands. These numbers are interesting by itself. Also the diversity. I mean, you see Portugal and Switzerland coming in the later editions. But what is made is more clear, the influence of migration and the influence of immigrants on the Dutch national football team is the next slide, which is where I took this notion of migrant players a bit more broad and have looked at dual nationality or players with a migration background. So players who are also, for example, born in the Netherlands, but have a father or mother who's from Suriname or whatever other country. And then again, you see that the influence of, in particular, the Surinamese have been quite a lot. So in that sense, the Dutch national team has really been relying on immigrants in their performances. Well, with some famous examples, of course, Clarence Seedorf and Edgar Davids, I guess most of you will know them. Well, those who are born in Suriname but have been competing for the Netherlands all the time, but also players as Michael Reiserijk, Gaston Torment, who were born in the Netherlands but have Surinamese roots. So what to take from my short talk about is of three things: that the presence of foreign players in certain national teams and in the World Cup is nothing new. It's basically a reflection or an echo of former migration systems. That international football is a space of migration par excellence and shows some signs of diversification, which is interesting. And most of all, it's always important to historically contextualize and nuance figures and examples of foreign-born players and migrant athletes. I think that's about it for me. If you have any questions, Daniel, please feel free.
Thank you, Gijs. And I think we have many questions to you later on in the discussion, but let's move forward to our second panelist, who is a dual citizen of Pakistan and Australia, Sarah Baba. Sarah is the Associate Director for Research at CIRS, and her work on migration and labor policies in the Persian Gulf states has been published in leading academic journals worldwide. Sarah, with which terms and analytic frameworks can we study and speak of migrants in global football? And what are the implications of using such framings of migrant athletes in national sport representations?
Thank you, Daniel, for the kind introduction and for giving me this very interesting question to actually direct my remarks at. There are basically two particular frameworks or lenses through which migrant athletes and migrant footballers have been examined or studied, and which we also use just to analyze and discuss ourselves. The first of these is the lens of elite migration. Elite migration refers to the global mobility of highly skilled professionals in certain specialized sectors. And we're really talking about the sort of ultra highly skilled, Nobel laureates in the sciences, or artists and musicians with extraordinary abilities, or of course, athletes who've got a demonstrated high performance abilities. Many countries have adopted specific privileged programs when it comes to this elite category of migrant. Privileged access in terms of the kinds of visa arrangements they can access. They may not have to go through all the normal bureaucratic processes that you would normally do. They can get fast-tracked access to work permits and international, for international employment. And in some cases, they might even find easier routes to naturalization, permanent settlement, citizenship. If we think of the United States O or P category visas, for example, these would apply to elite migrants. Saskia Saskin has spoken about individuals who fall within this class of mobility as the transnational elite class, and suggests that they engage in a form of continuous circulation and mobility within countries, across borders, into countries, and rely on their extensive globalized professional and personal networks, which allow them to engage in this kind of hypermobile behavior without the usual restrictions. So that's one framing that's used for migrant footballers. But there is a second, and probably one where there's increasing scholarship now, which is the migration framework of sports labor migration. Sports labor migration as a field of studies has been growing and expanding, particularly from the early 2000s. And this framework, if we like theories of sports labor migration, suggests that athletes are really but one more form of skilled labor that states draw on and deploy to meet their own developmental ambitions. Theories of sports labor migration, to some extent, suggest that there are core states which control or dominate the global political economy of sports, and that talented athletes based in peripheral states or semi-peripheral states are attracted to, drawn to, lured to, enticed to these core states, where really they function as sports workers and they deploy their athletic labor into these markets, which sometimes, and sometimes their athletic labor is exploited for the purposes of profit by sports entertainment and sports media, the sports media industry. So depending on where, where we place our migrant athletes into which of these two frames, we end up with very, different sets of ideas, questions, and conclusions about what the experiences of migration are for international footballers. Are these individuals who have great agency over their mobility, who benefit from special treatment and enjoy privileged access to international jobs and can potentially fast track to obtaining additional citizenships? Or are they instead a vulnerable group of athletes, a subgroup of athletes who suffer disadvantages, who do not enjoy the possibilities for advancing their professional and personal goals, but experience rather forms of exploitation and vulnerability that their migration status brings them, which are similar to other forms of transnational workers, transnational labor migrants? Are these elite individuals crossing borders for temporary periods of stay just to galvanize their careers and earn enormous sums of money? Or are they instead vulnerable labor migrants who can be who face the similar challenges, restrictions, and vulnerabilities of other categories of labor migrant who require an additional layer of protection? So are they out for themselves, or do they genuinely want to move and migrate to contribute to societies and to belong to the adopted lands where they end up? So as in the case of most things, binary thinking doesn't help us, and trying to place a complex and increasingly sort of heterogeneous group of migrant athletes into either one of these two static and oversimplified categories doesn't really help us. It doesn't move us forward, because we need to think about the complexities of the experience that these international footballers have. We should be looking to adopt analytic tools and terminologies that are attentive to and reflect the diversity of migrant athletes' experiences. While we've heard that sports mobility has been with us for ages, I think what is apparent is there's a diversification in the countries of origin for migrant athletes, and as well as the countries they're ending up in. So it is important that the language we use is more inclusive and more aware of this. Generally, we tend to think of elite migrants as people who are able to leverage their talents, their extraordinary gifts, and tend to experience migration very positively because they have a privileged form of migration and have a lot of inclusion and are not marginalized. Labor migrants, on the other hand, by and large, we know, tend to experience imbalances of power, exploitation, and exclusion. So, but the reality for many of the transnational athletes, including these footballers, will be nuanced and might not align exactly with either of those two extremes. So international footballers, I think we can say with some certainty these days, will experience migration with a great deal of variety, depending on their context of migration, where they're migrating from, where they're migrating to, their own other personal circumstances, and of course also their cultural, economic, and social resources that they have at their disposal. So I think I'll wrap up here, and I'm happy to speak about this more in the Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sarah. Our third panelist, Edward Collar, is a citizen of Canada, a country that might surprisingly qualify for the second time in the history of the event for the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Eddie is an associate professor of history at GUQ and is currently serving as Georgetown Qatar's faculty chair. He is particularly interested in the history of international law and currently writing a book on the history of the passport. Eddie, you have researched, as I just said, the history of the passport. What does a passport say or not say about a player's bond with a country? And could you share examples of historically successful national football teams that were diverse and have proven the complexity of national identity in international sports?
Super. Thanks so much, Daniel. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to downplay my own research in this forthcoming book I'm writing about passports, but the simple answer to your question about, what a passport says about a player's bond to a country is, not very much, really. We got to be clear about these different, frankly, terms we're using. This event is called Who Belongs to a Country. The question of your bond to a country, in the question you just asked me, the question of belonging in a country in the event's title, and the legal status of if you can be in that country are three very different things. And, a passport is really just an indicator of that last point. What is your legal status as a citizen who can benefit from the rights and privileges associated with being a member of a state? The most notable one associated with passports, of course, is a right to enter, remain, travel easily within your own country and in others. Now, what matters behind that legal status, the acquisition of the passport, is a country's various laws with respect to citizenship. Now, that can be because you're born in a country's territory. It can be because you're getting citizenship according to your parents' their own citizenship. Those are the two most common ways, and it's this dichotomy that's often used in the literature about citizenship. But again, every country has its own specific set of rules, and it's frankly quite diverse. Then there's naturalization, and again, all states do this differently based on different criteria, periods of residency, certain resources or skills you bring along. I mean, there are some countries where if there's enough money, you can get a passport, and one of the skills you can bring is one of these, elite or what was the terminologies are used about, people who have, these Nobel Prize winners or these great footballers who can, be accorded citizenship based on those skills. So again, this is what matters behind whether you get a passport or not. And so taken from that perspective, passports are merely the sort of the credential that shows your status. And again, then the benefits you receive according with that, nationality status. But on the other hand, passports have this huge symbolic value. There's this great scene, and I'm a big James Bond fan. There's a great scene in one of the Bond movies, The Living Daylights, where, James Bond is sliding down a mountainside on a cello with, a Soviet Eastern Bloc defector, and they're coming towards a border crossing. They're being pursued, and he holds up his British passport and he says, "Nothing to declare," and they sort of go through the barrier, right? And so, that passport, the power associated with that little booklet is something that is, like I said, powerful. And this is where, the bond with a country and the belonging can become quite interesting, but quite complex. Again, some people just get their passports based on an accident of birth, and sometimes they can have 2 or 3 different passports and have a stronger bond with one, no bond with another. But for other people, their passports can be hugely meaningful. For example, think about a refugee that might flee from their country, with which they have perhaps a strong bond, and will continue to forever, but they find safety and citizenship in a new place. And when they get that new passport, that'll mean a lot to them. So kind of, again, just like Zara said, a lot of this is personal. A lot of this is about the individual experience, the nuance that comes with it. And I would imagine, I don't know many players who are elite football players. In fact, I don't know any, but I would imagine that, some of them who compete for a country with which they have little connection, little bond, they might, not care. They're just looking to play in the premier global sporting event. Others might look upon this as a hugely beneficial opportunity and be grateful for the country, that gave them this opportunity. So that's what I would say in answer to your first question. Your second question about historical examples, I'll be very quick here. I mean, as you remarked, Canada rarely, if ever, makes it into the World Cup. And as a result, as a good Canadian, I don't cheer for them, but my team is France. France, speaking, I could go into belonging and bond about my love of France, a country for which I do not hold a passport for a very long time. I first fell in love with the World Cup and football as, a kid from Canada watching the 98 World Cup, and France wins, it's great. But the way that these national football teams can become a focus of attention on a diverse country, a diverse team, and how that can excite pride, but also excite anger in how the nation's being represented, especially on this international stage, is quite interesting. I mean, in my opinion, quite horrible French political figure on the far right, Jean-Marie Le Pen, after 1998, after the victory, he said, well, that team doesn't look particularly France. But that's even another issue, how someone looks versus how someone feels versus how someone belongs. It's all, again, as Zahra said, very, very, very nuanced. And so that's where I think I will wrap up my comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Eddie. Our fourth panelist is a dual citizen of the United States and Germany, Peter Spiro. He is a professor of law at Temple University in Philadelphia. His last two books were titled At Home in Two Countries, The Past and Future of Dual Citizenship, and Citizenship, What Everyone Needs to Know. Peter, what is the role of dual citizenship holders in international sports? And could you please explain what Olympic citizenship means, a term you coined in one of your books? And since we are an American university, could you also discuss the role immigrants have played in the history of the United States national teams?
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel, for the introduction and for hosting this very interesting event. Good morning from Philadelphia. So I want to come at this, I'm going to get to Daniel's questions, but I want to start by questioning the underlying requirement that competitors hold the nationality of the state for which they compete. So under FIFA rules, and this is very typical of international sporting federation rules, you have to be a national of the country for which you compete. I mean, it's interesting that nobody's mentioned that so far, but I guess it's taken for granted. And then there may be the additional requirements that sporting federations impose with respect to something in addition to nationality, and FIFA does impose such requirements in an attempt to make this about a competition between peoples, right? So that, and my comments follow, I think, nicely on Eddie's comments about the meaning of citizenship and holding a passport. The assumption here is that if you are a national, and then and on top of that, having to have been a resident of a country for 2 years in the case of FIFA, or having been born in the country, or having a grandparent who was born in the country, the assumption is that these are people who are organically a part of these national communities. And that goes back, I think, to an era, and in my view, this is completely outmoded, that this is a romantic, nostalgic conception of the state citizen connection, and goes back to days when sports used to be like a kind of surrogate warfare. So I'm old enough to go back to the Cold War days when the US and the USSR, this was one battlefield that we could duke it out on. And it was absolutely the case that those who were on the US ice hockey team and those who were on the Soviet hockey team were very much of those states. And there was, you could no more play for the other side than you could go join their military. In my view, that's completely outmoded in the contemporary context, and attempts to reinscribe what is known as a genuine links approach to citizenship are doomed to fail. So genuine links, coming from, Eddie, I'm sure will be familiar with this, the 1955 International Court of Justice decision in the Nottebohm court case, which set forth this notion of citizenship as a comprehending social attachment to a state, that attempts to impose that kind of genuine links or maintain that genuine links approach in the context of a sporting competition are doomed to fail, because the premise that those who have citizenship in a state have actual sociological attachment to that state no longer holds. And not just through citizenship, if you also, even if you add these extra requirements of birth, place of birth, or descent, or residency, it's no longer the case that an individual's affinity, sentimental affinity, is going to align with his state of citizenship. And that's because many people now have or can secure citizenship on the basis of ancestry or birthplace or naturalization plus 2 years of residency, right? To train for a couple of years in a country without having any real attachment to that place. And the result is that these genuine links rules are being gamed. So Daniel asked about the US experience in what we call soccer. The most striking example of this was with respect to the 2014 US national football team, where the coach, a German coach, German-born, German citizen. I don't think you don't have to be a citizen of the country to be a coach for that country's team, but he went hunting for dual nationals in European states, or those who had been born by happenstance in the United States and who then had citizenship in the United States and qualified under the additional FIFA rules just by accident. But he went looking to identify those players who who grew up in the European culture in which football is much more of a facilitated undertaking, and he found 9 or 10 players who had U.S. citizenship, either by place of birth or, in the case of a number of German American dual citizens, who had a U.S. citizen father in all these cases, U.S. citizen service member posted in Germany. So they qualified under FIFA rules, but these were not Americans in any sociological sense. And so the idea that, I mean, a good example of the FIFA rules, which are clearly have the object of making a team be of the country, sort of bypassed, gamed, really, is what you have in these cases. Daniel asked about dual citizenship and how this fits into the picture. Crucial element here is that now dual citizenship is now nearly universally accepted by states, and so you can find individuals who have this extra citizenship or can acquire this extra citizenship on the basis of, for instance, a grandparent, and they don't have to forfeit their primary citizenship. If you still had norms against dual citizenship, we would see none of this activity, because in most cases, it wouldn't be worth it to give up your real citizenship, the one, your dominant locus of activity and sentimental attachment. It wouldn't be worth it to do that just for a competition. So when you had a couple of basketball players, US basketball players, who signed up for the Russian team, they had to get Russian citizenship for the Beijing Olympics. Never would have happened if they had to renounce their US citizenship in the process. So dual citizenship is a key facilitator of this kind of activity, which gives rise to, it's just arbitrary. The result is arbitrary, both from the team's perspective. Can I find somebody who qualifies under these rules, even though they're not really American? Also from the individual competitor's perspective. Am I lucky enough to have had an American father, even though I'm not really American in any sense? And so that leads me to my proposal, and I'll wrap up here, which is just get rid of the nationality rules altogether and go to a club sports model, what we in the US would call free agency. Let anybody compete for any national team, regardless of nationality. That's how we do domestic sports. When I root for my own US football team, I don't look to see whether they're from Philadelphia or not, and I'm still rooting for them. When it comes to ice hockey, most of the Philadelphia Flyers aren't even American, and I still might root for them if I were an ice hockey fan. So I don't think it would change the intensity of fan affiliation, and most players, or many players, would of course end up just playing for their country of real attachment, even if they had other opportunities. For the top players, it's a branding exercise. It's not about the money. And so you'd still have pretty good correlation between an individual's citizenship and effective attachments and the teams for which they would play. And then the bottom line is it would improve the quality of competition, because you'd have the best players on the field without these artificial rules constraining their capacity to compete. So I'll wrap there and look forward to our discussion.
All right, thank you very, very much, Peter. I'm not concerned anymore about having a controversial debate later on after your far-reaching suggestions. But let's first move to our fifth and last panelist, who is from the Republic of Ireland, Ross Griffin. Ross is an assistant professor of American literature at Qatar University. His research interests include the relationship between sport and culture, national identity, and sports history, particularly in the Gulf region. Ross is the Middle East academic editor for the International Journal of the History of Sport. Ross, the Qatari national men's team mainly relies on long-term residents that were born and raised in the country. Is the Qatari national men's football team a true Qatari team? And for your own country, you tweeted earlier today when you shared the invite for this event that you would discuss tonight with us how, I hope I pronounce it correct, Bazuno, Ogbene, and Omo Bamidele are as Irish as red lemonade on a wet summer's day in Ballybunion. So I look forward to learn more about that.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to the four other panelists who I've been jotting down notes furiously as you've been speaking. Every one of you is going to hear echoes of what you said in what I'm going to say over the next 5 or 6 minutes or so. To answer your questions, Daniel, to begin with, the nature of the Qatar men's national team has been one that has been steeped in controversy for 10, 15 years now, ever since it came to light that the Qatar Football Association in 2005 or 6 was trying to get 3 Brazilian players who were playing in Germany at the time to represent them. These players had no prior links to the country whatsoever, and there was outrage amongst many football fans saying that this is not what national representation or international football is about. This led to a change in FIFA regulations. Sepp Blatter spoke out against it, and while it prevented those 3 chaps from togging out for Qatar, over the next 5, 6, 7 years, you did see some very unusual names in the Qatar team sheet. Names like Sebastian Soria, Rodrigo Tabata. These were guys who became naturalized, having spent time in Qatar playing for local teams. They went on to represent Qatar, their men's national team. So there was some seed of reality to this idea that Qatar was getting mercenaries, guys who didn't have a very deep link to Qatari society playing for them. But for many people, this is where the narrative stopped. And this is where a lot of the errors and, I suppose, misconceptions of Qatar, the Qatar men's national team, arise. Because simultaneously, the Aspire Academy was developing and churning out these young men who would go on to represent Qatar at an under-19 level. And these guys were primarily born in Qatar, raised in Qatar. They were an intrinsic part of the community in the city. And the QFA was looking around and saying, hold on a second, we've got these young men who won the under-19 Asian Championships, and we want to use these players. And it became such a bone of contention that the then coach, Juan Fossati, said no. And he resigned in protest. He wanted to keep the South Americans in situ because he felt that there was a greater chance of success. Felix Sanchez comes in, takes over, and implements a lot of these younger players, guys who I said were an intrinsic part of the community here, and they go on to win the Asian Championships at a senior level in February 2019, roughly 3 years ago, almost to the day. And that team was based off what you would call homegrown players. But still the controversies and the comments came, but these guys aren't Qatari. They're of Sudanese descent, Palestinian descent, Egyptian descent. So it seems to me that Qatar was being held to a much higher standard of nationality than many other countries. And as Gijs has pointed out with the Dutch national team, there was a lot of guys in that Dutch national team coming from other nations following migration patterns. And this is the, I suppose, the issue that we have to address in the next minute or so, because you're asking me the question, is the Qatar men's national team a true national team? And to answer that, we very briefly have to address, well, what is a true nationals team? A true national team. Gijs has done this for me, because as he said, and what I agree with entirely, it's a team that represents the society that exists in that place. Like, to look for a national team that's ethnically pure to that nation, you're moving towards a mythic national identity that never really exists. Like, every single one of us has a little bit of something else in us, whether we like it or not. This idea of ethnic purity it's nonsensical almost. And the Qatari national team is one that reflects the cosmopolitanism that exists in Qatar. And we have to move away, as Zara said, from these binaries that are not the least bit helpful. And I'm going to mention a name now. I think he might be registered, but Gijs would know him very, very well. Professor Gijsberg Unk in Erasmus University. He has developed this wonderfully nuanced model for looking at citizenship, which does away with these binaries of us versus them. And it's a thick and thin model of citizenship, which includes things like, yes, birthright and descent, but also your contribution to a society. And that's the thickest form of citizenship, with the thinnest being those guys that just step off a plane and walk onto a pitch the following day to represent the nation. The guys were there for pure monetary gain. But if you examine the nature of the Qatar men's national team, you're going to see that a lot of those players, people like Abdul Karim Hassan and Bassam Al-Rawi, these guys are a part of the community here. They contribute. If you look at things like, say, in recent times, the vaccine rollout in Qatar, Abdul Karim very publicly on Twitter volunteered for that. He was the guy in one of the centers taking your details. If you look at the national sports days, it's very common to see people like Gali Muazzali and Bassam Al-Rawi taking part in community events. The point I'm making here is these guys aren't coming in, hiding behind 15-foot walls, collecting a check and playing soccer once a week. They're a part of the communities that they live in. For the most part, they were born here. And we're going to talk about the few that weren't in a couple of seconds, but they were born here for the most part. They followed the migration patterns that Gijsberg mentioned. They came from Sudan, Egypt, Palestine. They were brought here by their parents. They weren't kidnapped in the middle of the night by an eagle-eyed soccer scout who said he could be quite handy in 10 years' time. They followed their parents as 5, 6, 7-year-old children who came here as engineers, as doctors. And they've been a part of Qatari society, going to school here, learning, making friends here. Every single part of that, their upbringing has been in this country. And it seems to me that a lot of Western commentators, particularly, whether just uninformed or motivated by other dynamics, they focus on Qatar as this nation of mercenaries, when it really is not. You seldom find a team that is as fused together as the Qatar men's national team, seeing as they've been playing alongside one another with that coach since they were 13, 14, 15, 16 years of age. These guys have essentially grown up here. The only players that would be exempt from that would be 2 Algerian players and a Portuguese player. And you could say, okay, they're on the thin side of citizenship. But to even say that would ignore the fact that each of those players, Khuki, Budayev, and Petro, they have all been here for about 10 years apiece. As I said, these guys are in this community and they're a part of it. the bigger question has to be asked, what distinguishes these players in Qatar from players in Europe? Now, I'm not going to go over examples that Eddie would have given or Heis would have given, but it struck me watching the Euros in the summer there, when the English national team, they played against Denmark, and they had 7 players who were eligible directly or through their parents to play for somebody else. And you see Raheem Sterling, a person who was born in Jamaica, and he is taken for granted as an Englishman. What's the difference between him and someone like Ali Moazali, who was born in Khartoum and was brought here by his parents? Both players migrated from a different country at a very young age to represent another country. You look at players like Jadon Sancho, Bukayo Saka. These players are players who were born to parents from Nigeria and Trinidad and Tobago. They were born in England. What separates them from people like Asim Madibo, Abdelaziz Hatem, or Abdul Karim Hassan, players who were born in Qatar to Sudanese parents? There's no real case where you can make and say, well, but he's different and he's this. The players are a part of the community here. So you have to ask the question, what standard is the Qatar men's national team being judged by? Why is it different to one that's accepted as normal by European countries? And to wrap it, my last big point I want to make is to put it in an Irish context. When you put Qatar in the list of countries that absorb or take or use players with dual nationalities or affiliations to other countries, they're not even in the top 10, 20 even. France have both instances of their World Cup wins. Holland, Spain, England, Ireland would be amongst the worst offenders if you were to look at it on a historical basis. And Gijs is laughing here because he knows where I'm going with this. Italian 90, we had 16 players out of 22 that were born in Britain. And I'm going to go back to Peter's comments about gaming the system and hunting for players. Jurgen Klinsmann didn't pick that up off the ground. Jack Charlton was the master of hunting players in England because he was the Irish manager at the time, and himself and his assistant, Maurice Setters, literally went from club to club asking managers, do you have players of Irish descent? If so, we'd like to talk to them and see if they want to come and play for us. And you had this bizarre situation where you had players like John Aldridge and Ray Houghton, who would make their debuts for Ireland in September 1986, playing against Wales, having arrived in the country the day before, never having been to Ireland before because of grandmothers that emigrated 60, 70 years previous. Ireland has been doing this for 30, 40 years. And to go back to, I suppose, the question that we originally started at, like, do these players represent us? That Irish team, made up mainly of the diaspora of Irish people, represented Ireland in 2 World Cups in the early 90s, and they were embraced as us. If you look at the Irish team today, you're going to see a host of surnames that historically you would rarely ever spot in Irish society. Adamida, you have Ogbene, Obama Medele, and Gavin Bazunu, players that are definitely guaranteed 100% going to take us to a World Cup in the next 4 to 8 years. Gavin Bazunu is probably one of the greatest, potentially, goalkeepers in England at present. He is vaunted and wanted by many, many Premier League teams. These guys, you could say, well, they're all of Nigerian extraction. Are they Irish? You listen to them speak in interviews, they have Cork accents, Dublin accents. They identify as Irish. If anybody says, well, do they represent us? You're saying, yeah, of course they represent us. They represent the society that Ireland is today, a much more diverse place than it ever was. So when people look at the Qatar men's national team, you're saying the exact same thing. Do they represent us? Yes, they represent the community that's here, this community made up of a wide array of diaspora. And there's a diversification coming from the myriad Sudanese, Palestinian, Egyptian players, as well as Qataris that play for Qatar. Because on the underage teams now, you're seeing Indonesian players of Indonesian extraction, Bangladeshi extraction. These guys are all coming up through the ranks as Qatar becomes more and more diverse. And that's pretty much where I'll leave it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ross. We are opening the Q&A now. Some of you have already asked questions. So you go on the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens, please, when you have a question. I will then read out the audience's question and try to direct them to the best panelist. I think most of you have not written for whom the question is, so I try to identify one, and we want to try to incorporate as many questions as possible. So I will usually direct maybe one question to one panelist, but if another panelist also would like to comment, please send me a message or raise your hand. So Ross, there is a specific question for Pedro, the player, and maybe also the question, just a clarification required, players playing for the country get passport only for the time playing the particular tournament or for good? That's a good question.
Is that for me?
Yeah, I think it's for you.
Yeah, okay. From what I know, that basically if you represent Qatar, you get a form of sports passport that allows you to travel as representative of the national team. Whether they're allowed to keep those passports, I don't think so. Heard anecdotally from athletes who represent Qatar and other countries that no, you don't get to keep that passport. It's specifically for the function of traveling for that sports event. But as Eddie points out very well in his discussion, does your passport equal a sense of identity or belonging to a nation? Do you feel any less belonging just because you haven't got that little piece of paper, that little book with the stamp in it that says you aren't part of your community? So they are two different, in my mind, they're two different things. And it's something I've been asked by people, well, do they have a passport? And well, maybe if they do, if they don't, even if they don't, that doesn't mean they can't just leave and go on holiday if they want to. They're not prisoners. The passport is something they take with them when they represent Qatar.
Mm-hmm. There is another question, Eddie, maybe you might want to answer it specifically on Mesut Özil, and he's quoted with, I'm a German when we win and an immigrant when we lose. What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. It again just shows the fluidity of this, about identity, about belonging, about status, right? You know, and now performance in sport. I want to go back, you know, to something, you know, so many of the comments by my panelists have been intriguing, but I really want to go back to something, you know, Peter said about the outdated nature of this system that requires you, and, you know, again, others have talked about this, you know, essentialized idea that, you know, you are representing the country. And again, as Peter said, you're almost like, it's like you're fighting a war on behalf of that country, and it's the country's honor that's at stake. And why this has sort of remained in sport as opposed to in other like industries is so interesting to me, because, you know, I've spent my entire professional career in Qatar. You know, I'm a Canadian citizen. I haven't lived in Canada in a very long time. I was educated in a variety of different countries. I have this bond and this love of the French football team. I work here in Qatar. So like, you know, that is my identity. And you know, this brings us back to belonging and bond too, you know, but this particular issue of sport, that if I weren't to compete for Canada, if I were a great football player and somehow that's wrong, is I just find so fascinating. So I just want to say, Peter, I really appreciate your comments on that.
The next question, Peter, is for you. You spoke about real attachment citizenship, but many multinationals feel real attachment to each citizenship. And even if not a citizen, feel attachment to another country as well due to long-term residency. Is there not a value still to national competitions rather than turning all competitions to mercenary players and accepting that we can balance multiculturalism with national, even multinational pride? Yeah, thanks, Susan Billings, for that great question.
Yeah, excellent question. And absolutely, it's the case that many people who hold a passport in a state in which they have citizenship or for which they compete have a real attachment. And it could be on the basis of descent. I mean, people are attached to the homeland of their grandparents in many cases, or the place they were born, even if they're not living there, or a country to which they've naturalized. And Ross's description of some of the Qataris, very interesting in terms of how they are actually very much enmeshed in the community. The problem is it's very difficult to sort those people with sort of what might be considered authentic connections from the people who are just doing it on an instrumental basis. And the FIFA rules are an attempt to do that by adding an additional layer to the nationality requirement that you have the grandparent or the birthplace or the 2 years of residency. But obviously a lot of people who have citizenship, who acquire citizenship on the basis of their grandparent, have no attachment to that country. And you can't distinguish between the two. And with the stakes as big as they are in international sporting competition, inevitably people are going to act strategically here on both ends, both on the buying end, so to speak, those who are looking to compose these teams, but then also in terms of the players who may or may not have the eligibility. So I'm not sure. So I'm not saying this is a great thing. I mean, but it is the world in which we live, and trying to go back to the world in which we used to live just is, I don't see how that can actually be accomplished.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of questions for Ross, but let's first have a question for Gijs by William Worster. I wonder if you can talk about Peter's comments that he cheers for his team regardless of the nationality of the players. How does this change when the team is winning or losing? I noticed that Japan is claiming the recent Nobel Prize winner who lost his Japanese nationality when he naturalized as a US citizen.
Well, I think Peter was mainly talking in a sense on domestic sports. So, well, that's kind of been normalized to cheer for everybody who has the shirt on his representative team. But in international sports, and it brings also a bit the case of Özil back in this game, is that you do see some signs of, and I'll be a bit reliant here to speak out very strongly, that if a team is winning, and it's also the 1998 French team, for example, then the diversity of a national team and players with a migration background and even the foreign-born ones are cheered for, are, well, one of us, so to speak. But when they start losing, mostly the first one to be scapegoated are the ones who are different, and often the ones who are physically different or the ones who are, in a sense, different in terms of nationality. Well, you see that with Özil. Of course, there was a political take on him as well. But taking that out of account, which is hardly impossible, I would admit instantly that he and Gundogan were both scapegoated for the bad results of Germany, as they got kicked out in the first round after, well, 4 years earlier, they were the world champion. The same goes for the last European Championship. England lost in the final on penalties against Italy, if I'm correct. But 3 players who missed the penalties both had a migration background and were basically instantly racially abused online and also on the pitch. So there is something in it that as long as the national team wins, everybody belongs to the us group, but when they start losing or doing, well, less good as perspective or as expected of them, then they become more of the outsiders based on different factors that different markers that might determine who and who does not belong to a nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always a hierarchy. I agree. I think
can I just follow up on that a little bit? Can I follow up
Yes.
on that briefly? I mean, it's fascinating because, and I think the racial point here is very important because, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that about England this year. I mean, Marcus Rashford, his grandparents came to the UK. I mean, his family's been in the UK about as long as my family's been in Canada, right? But it's the racism there that mattered, frankly, less than like a migration identity. But secondly, why I brought up the French example is so interesting because it was the attention paid to the national team as this great celebratory moment that caused a lot of, again, racist people in France to not celebrate inclusion, but rather say, I can't be happy about this because that team doesn't look French enough. And so it's not quite, you know, when you win, you're a member of the community, and when you lose, you're not. Because in France, they won. And yet Jean-Marie Le Pen famously identified them as being, you know, really that team, this would be happy, except they're just not French enough. And so it's, again, it's super complicated.
Mm-hmm. I believe the next question is for Sarah. I was hoping the panelists could speak to another aspect of the relationship between sports migration and other modes of migration, the impact of sports migration discourse on the perception of the belonging of other migrants within a particular society, and relatedly, how the discourse shapes the experiences of players of color who do hold citizenship, sometimes from birth, but have their citizenship belonging called into question.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Daniel. I think there are also a couple of questions specifically related to, you know, the question of citizenship for other categories of migrants that were earlier, and they were sort of pressing against not what Ross is saying, which is that it's absolutely fine for these players to be representing Qatar and that they should be included, and that the external criticism that Qatar has gotten on this account is not entirely justified. But I think what these questions are alluding to is that in contexts where naturalized access to citizenship is extremely restricted or limited, then it does provoke a reaction, be it from local communities or even, you know, externally, which is, if in Ireland, for example, citizenship pathways are much easier for all categories of migrants. But in the Gulf states, we know this. I mean, citizenship is far more restrictive. And there are communities who are here laboring in other sectors, sometimes multi-generations. So I think that's where you get a sense of this is not an equal playing field, right? That if you are an elite athlete, you legitimately should be awarded citizenship and you gain it. But what about others who are contributing or who have contributed? So I think that is an issue, right? I mean, and from a policy perspective, perhaps athletes who are representing Qatar at the national level are considered to be in an exceptional elite category of migrant. I think it also speaks to the ambiguity about the place that sports have in a society at a sociological level. I mean, is this a form of labor or is it something else, right? So, but yes, I mean, that is several of the questions I think are attributed to this, you know, which is there is a difference. Migrant athletes are able to gain citizenship. It's much harder for others.
Yeah, I think some of the comments fit very well to what you just said. For example, by Sarah Abdul Razak, who's one of our students. Yeah. She writes, I agree with Professor Griffin's take on how there is no such thing as one ethnicity and how we all have a little bit of different ethnic heritages within us. However, is this not ironic when the Qatari citizenry and government value pure bloodness so much? Think of the strict Qatari legislation surrounding inter-ethnic marriages among Qataris. This needs to be approved by a committee in the government, by the way. Basically the government making it very difficult for Qataris to pick spouses who hold citizenship from other countries or are ethnically different, as well as the legislation surrounding the exclusivity of Qatari citizenship. And then also another comment, players born in Qatar, of course, can play for Qatar, but others who were born in Qatar and don't play soccer are not awarded Qatari nationality. And Sterling was a British citizen before he became a soccer player. Ross, you want to comment on that? You're muted.
The first part of it, without dodging the question at all, I'd refer everybody to read Zara's paper, The Cost of Belonging, because if you want an education in citizenship law and the vagaries of it in Qatar, I always turn to that. So there's some reading for people if they wanted it, haven't read it already. Relating to, as I'm not going to, Zara is the expert on that particular matter, so I won't attempt to pretend that I am. But relating to Raheem Sterling, as a British citizen before he moved to Britain, I don't see how that plays a massive factor. Jumping on Reis's point, his parents would have been most likely economic migrants. As a 2-year-old, when he left Jamaica, I doubt Raheem Sterling had much of a say in the discussion as to whether they would stay or go. The fact is that he is embraced as an English person, a representative of England, when he puts on that white jersey. And the question I asked was, how do you distinguish between someone like him and someone like Ali Moaz Ali, who in an equal sense went from Khartoum to Doha with his parents as a small child, who still receives criticism, was complained by the UAE during the Asian Championships in 2019, said this guy isn't properly Qatari. We don't see any complaint about, as Reis mentioned, Jadon Sancho, Bukayo Saka. These are players who would have equally stretched ties to the English national football team if you want to look at their Nigerian and Caribbean backgrounds. So I don't see, I don't mean to diminish anyone, but the fact that he was a British citizen as a 2-year-old, I doubt that played much of a part in the decision making. Other than that, there was a path set out where it was very common from the Windrush generation onwards for particularly people from Jamaica to migrate to Britain in search of work.
Yeah, I think this question from my colleague Santiago, who is from the only other small nation that ever hosted the World Cup, Uruguay, might be for Reis. One argument is that diversity in terms of nationality might encourage people from one country to be more tolerant with foreign-born. On the other hand, it could exacerbate tensions and generate rejection, in line with Eddie's comment about Le Pen, due to perceived loss of identity. Do you know whether it has been studied what dominates, and if so, are there any differences in terms of countries and sports?
Well, I think both processes happened at the same time. It's kind of like a bit of a matter of perspective. I mean, to get back to Eddie's remark on the 1998 World Cup, yes, Le Pen was saying that, well, this was not really the French team winning it. Well, it's kind of like statements. They were, again, became hearable when France won in 2018. But at the same time, this French national team was also hyped because of the multi-ethnicity, the diversification of it, because it had black, white, and Arab players in it. So I think both processes happened at the same time. And on the one hand, it can be seen that former players are more tolerant towards it. And also, yeah, people say that they are not true representatives, although I'm not in favor of that aspect. I think it has been studied numerous times, at least, this dichotomy, although I prefer to also, as Zara indicated, we should talk about it in a more complex sense. Well, I did or tried to do so in taking on the case of Mesut Özil on his resignation of the German national team by indicating both processes that are happening at the same time.
Eddie, you are being, Peter would like to yeah.
I sort of want to ask a question here. Since you all are much more expert on club football in the European context, where I know there's some complicated rules about how many non-nationals you can have on different teams, but I'm not sure about that. But in any case, I wonder if, so you've got these cases where the person with the immigrant background gets called out when they miss the penalty, when they miss the penalty shot or the shootout shot. If we got rid of the nationality rules, then you wouldn't, and what's galling about that is they're not outsiders. You know, they're second or third generation from immigrant backgrounds, and it's about race. If we just got rid of the nationality rules, would people focus on, I mean, you still have the racial element, I'm sure, but people wouldn't focus on whether you're from here or not, or that kind of stuff. And I wonder if there's some lesson from just professional football.
Peter, there has been one groundbreaking judgment in European football, which has been the Bosman judgment by the European Court of Justice. And since then, clubs can play with 11 foreigners, and it has happened a number of times that, you know, major brands like Arsenal would have in their starting 11 not one English player. And so on the club level, it's happening in Europe, but elsewhere in the world, usually there are caps that just a certain number of foreign players are allowed, and this applies also to the Qatari Stars League. Eddie, you raised your hand, and you are also asked how excited you are about Canada's qualification for the World Cup and how diverse is the team.
So on that point, I'm extremely excited. I woke up a couple of days ago to a message in the morning from my dad about Canada's recent victory. I woke up to a message yesterday morning from my brother, or this morning actually, about, okay, we're gonna bid for tickets because Canada. So the answer is very excited. I want to go back. Sorry, I remuted myself. I'd like to go back to Santi's question. And Santi, I look forward to watching a lot of football with you when World Cup starts. There hasn't been, to my knowledge, a lot of research about this on the nationality level, but one of our former students and a former not panel, but event in this CIRS repertoire, I think, was by someone looking at this at the religious level, and Mo Salah, and how his just being at Liverpool has reduced sort of anti-Islamic sentiment in the area. And so that there is some evidence to suggest that this happens. And going back to the point about, when you lose, you're not part of the community. When you win, you improve people's views of those communities. That was a very interesting discussion with our former student, Salma Musa, who when we talked about her great research on the subject. I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten now. So sorry.
Yeah,
absent-minded professor.
No problem. Sarah also would like to add something.
Actually, I wanted to respond a bit to Peter's comments, both just now and earlier. While I consider myself a complete non-nationalist, so I understand the removal of these sort of clauses of nationality and allegiance makes sense. There is, what about sentiments of like protecting labor markets, right? Are jobs, like football jobs, are they jobs? Is it a labor market? Don't you, to some extent, is it just like the sort of capitalist market exploding? What about provoking those kinds of sensitivities amongst a population? Isn't there some level of where you could actually have a response where your entire cohort comes from abroad? In any other labor market sector, this would provoke a huge response. Is sports somehow in your?
Well, I guess at an elite level, maybe, just in terms of numbers, it's not as important as broader labor markets, but it does give rise. I don't know if you all are familiar with Ayelet Shakar's work on the concept of Olympic citizenship writ large, which I think resonates with Zara's approach to this, that you've got it, it's part of commodification of all markets. It's easy to apply the label neoliberal to these to my kind of proposal, and I guess I'm not valorizing it. These trends, but I'm saying that it's really impossible to sort of put the genie back in the bottle and go back to where we used to be. So that's it's in some ways I'm saying we should just raise the white flag on this and let things go where they may. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a great thing. There were lots of great things about the old days when we could root for the American team against the Soviet team, and that was a good place to channel our competition. But that's just not the world anymore.
Yeah, there are a number of questions which address the issue of do players of foreign origin get the full passport and with all the rights and benefits. I think maybe Sarah, you would like to discuss this question of full or mission passport, as it's often called here.
We're meant to be researching that, Daniel, aren't we? No, but what I think I'll look at the last, the last question, which is talking about, you know, are these, how permanent is a citizenship you're given, as opposed to like a birthright citizenship or something which is supposedly irrevocable. And that, of course, is being tested globally, right? We are seeing globally that a citizenship you acquire through naturalization or whatever eligibility criteria that are not actually tied to birth can end up being revoked, be it on criminal charges or for, you know, social behavior that breaks boundaries in certain authoritarian contexts. So that is happening to citizenship globally. There is an erosion of a sense that a citizenship can be permanent. And we've seen this in frequent, you know, increasingly, frankly, over the last 16, 17 years, there have been changes to citizenship laws in multiple contexts, which normally have large citizen populations. And so there's an anxiety about retaining this form of citizenship, which frankly is behavior-based, or perhaps in the case of athletes, performance-based.
Ross, I think the question, how many of the Qatari team members have full Qatari citizenship, is difficult to answer, right?
Well, if you believe the rumors, they all do now, having won the 2019 Asian Championships. Beforehand, it would have been quite difficult to answer. I don't think you would have got a definitive answer off anyone. There are a number of Qatari players born and bred to Qatari parents who were on that 2019 in that squad. But as I said, there was also a large number of players of Sudanese, Palestinian and Egyptian extraction. But the rumors going around town in the aftermath of that victory were that amongst the rewards that they received, and Zahra mentions this in her paper in Cost of Belonging, is that they were granted citizenship for doing a great deed to the state of Qatar. And that was one of the rewards, apparently, that they were given citizenship. And that's a part of the statutes of citizenship within Qatari law.
Yeah, it seems that it also happened after the 2015 Handball World Championships, that the Qatari team, who did very well at the tournament and made it to the final, that also the foreign-born players were awarded full citizenship afterwards. So it's kind of a reward in the current system.
Can I just say something, Daniel?
Yes, please, Eddie.
That's an interesting point, because going back to what I was saying about how every country has different rules about who gets citizenship, from what I understand, there are a fair number of the football players here in Qatar who are born and raised in Qatar. And they're, for example, they've got a Qatari mother and a Sudanese father. So in any other country, they might be considered, you know, a local, but in Qatar, when they win the, you know, Asian Cup and they get a passport, it's like, oh, they're giving this passport to someone who's not a local, when in fact, well, it's actually because of Qatar's original laws about citizenship. This person wasn't the Qatari passport holder until they won. So it's again, it's extremely complicated.
So can I ask, do they get a kind of temporary citizenship then, just good for the duration of the competitions or while they're on the team? Because that's quite, I mean, I understand Zahra's point about citizenship being more provisional, certainly in the counter-terror context, but I've never heard of a sort of a citizenship that expires upon, once you're no longer in the job, you no longer have the citizenship.
It's described as a mission passport. And speaking with people I know who've represented Qatar in international competition overseas, they describe it as the team manager would have the passports. You go through immigration, he gets them stamped, and that's it. You have your own passport of, if you're of Sudanese extraction, if that's the one you hold, and the mission passport is for your representation in that competition. And that's the system how it works.
It seems, Peter, since you are a law professor, that this is a gray area in international law. While here it seems to be done on a wide scale. I heard the same stories when working in Lebanon before. So this is something that seems to be done since the 1970s, but is not much reported. And the International Athletic Federation, they have a new rule since a couple of years that all athletes who represent the country need to be awarded full citizenship. But I don't know how the World Athletics, how they want to implement it or you know, prove that. Yeah, I'm just thinking for whom that question is. Maybe Ross, do you think that Qatar's decision to give citizenship to sports players is a representation of how important sports is for the country in terms of diplomacy, soft hard power?
Oh, incredibly, incredibly so. Success on the pitch translates to a better image overseas. We're moving away from Qatar briefly. Look at Brazil, the glamour of that yellow jersey, the tropical beaches, the football stars, all these things are intertwined. A successful team on the pitch gives a much more powerful, much more acceptable image of a modern, developed, progressive, open society. The very important distinction to make, though, is, and I saw it in one of the comments there, Qatar isn't going out actively recruiting players in the sense that, say, to myself and Peter were speaking briefly about American football before this conversation started, and how American football teams would recruit players from college. You want to come and play for us, and college teams would do the same, come and play for Iowa or Michigan or whatever. Qatar isn't doing that. And this is the misconception that a lot of people make, that they're out actively looking for players, enticing them with a big bag of money, saying, come here, you want to play for us now. The vast majority of the players who are representing Qatar at the moment are guys who were born here or came here at a very early age as the children of economic migrants. They were schooled here, their friends here, their families are here. You couldn't really send Ali Moez or Abdul Karim Hassan to Sudan now because he grew up here, he was born here. His home is Doha. So it's very, very difficult to say, okay, you can go home now, because he says to you, well, this is here for me. So from a soft power image, the fact that Qatar is using these players that are a part of their community is an important one. Transitioning away from this model, which would have been a lot more distasteful if you had an abundance of Brazilians and Uruguayans and other players, so that the Qatar national team of yesteryear would have been a stitchwork of different nationalities. That would have smacked of something very, very mercenary. The current team is much more local.
Peter, there is a question for you. Sport federations that require genuine links, is that problematic from a human rights perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's another argument you can make against this. So, for instance, under the FIFA statute is very constraining in terms of transfers of nationality. So if you've already played, my understanding is if you've already played for one national team at the international level, you after a certain age, you can't then transfer to another country, even if you have genuine links to that other country. And so from the athlete's perspective, it's like a kind of peonage. It's sort of modern day sports serfdom, under which once you've made that commitment to one country, that's it. You're, even if the other country, you've got some real attachment to that country, you can't switch up. So, it's not human rights in the sense of, nobody's being brutally mistreated, but it is a constraint on movement. And so I think one has to keep in mind that those individual interests are at stake, and that one can frame them in terms of rights that are being compromised.
Yeah, maybe the last question I read is for Ross, but I give it to Gijs, if that's okay. And the question is, does the practice of recruiting mercenary players put less wealthy countries at a disadvantage? If the best players from Nigeria, Egypt, or Sudan are recruited to represent other countries such as Qatar, these countries have fewer skilled players to represent them.
In some cases, it most probably will. I mean, not only, as mentioned before, I don't know who, but some of the other speakers said that not only football federations are looking for the best players to select and to gain them temporary or even permanent citizenship, but also the players themselves are on the lookout for opportunities. So what you see, and it's also what happens over time, is that many players are looking to get to the best national football team to represent. Because playing internationally can give you value for your professional career. But if it not works out to play for the bigger team, then you can always opt for the lesser team and still be an international. To give an example, quite a lot of Dutch players who can't make it or won't make it to the Dutch national team, but have somehow Surinamese roots because of mainly because of their parents, they're now competing for Suriname. And the same goes for many other countries, and in particular nowadays, African countries are strategically using their diaspora, their African diaspora. So, for example, Morocco at the last World Cup had 16 or 17 players born abroad. 5 of them were born in the Netherlands, I think 7 in France or something alike, and even 1 Canadian, I recall. So Morocco, in that sense, could even field a whole European national team. And in that sense, that you could also say that they have benefited from recruiting these players, as it was since 1989, the first time they qualified for World Cups. So I think it's both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. It shows that simple center periphery models don't help to explain international sports. Apologies, Ross, I'm sorry, we are running out of time. Apologies to all the 11 or 12 unanswered questions. I would like to thank our panelists and all participants. Please also check out our website for past lectures, blog posts, and our podcast series. Our next event in the lecture series will be on March 20, 2022, and discuss how the FIFA World Cup 2022 has changed Qatar. Do follow CIRS and GUQ on social media to get updates about forthcoming events and other such activities. Thank you all, and we hope you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy. Take care.